We're going to go ahead and get started. So come on in and settle in. And so I'm going to start in Acts chapter 17. And I think online, and by the way, if you're watching online, welcome to our class. I called this answering difficult questions. I have to tell you, it's really not going to be answering difficult questions. It's going to be more about understanding postmodern evangelism and the younger generation that we're trying to reach with the gospel. And that will be a class for a different time. But I'll start in Acts chapter 17. And in Acts 17, Paul's in Athens, and he's at the Areopagus, which is a place where people would go to share philosophies and ideas and discuss religion. And when he meets there, in verse 19 it says, "Then they took him and brought him in a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, 'May we know what this new teaching is that you're presenting?'" So they heard Paul had these strange teachings, and they wanted to hear more about him. So they brought him to the Areopagus, where all these people came to listen about philosophy and theology and etc. So he says, "You're bringing some strange ideas, and we want to know what they all mean." So all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you're very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Now what you worship is something unknown I'm going to proclaim to you." So Paul was keen enough to pick up that they realized there's probably an unknown God. And so Paul says, you're right, there is an unknown God. And he says, verse 24, "The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. From one man he made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring." So he picked up on this altar to the unknown God, picked up on some of their poets that said we're the offspring of God, and he used that as a jumping off point to share Jesus with these men from Athens. Now, I say all that just to say that what Paul was really good at is he was good at contextual evangelism. We talked last week in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul said he became all things to all men so that he could win anyone he could for Christ. So thinking about the world we live in, it's called the postmodern world. How many of you heard that term? It's hard to have not heard that term these days. But let's start by explaining the difference between modernism and postmodernism and talk about the modern world. Most of us are products of the modern world, and even some of the younger generations, because of their upbringing, still are pretty rooted in the modern world, although there's more postmodern influence on all of us than we realize, as we're going to see as we go through this. But let's start with modernism. So modernism was kicked off with the advent of science. As scientific discoveries began to emerge, and they began to study our universe and learn about our universe, or learn about biology and geology, and learn about how things worked, then you have the scientific method, and they would do research, and they would have observations, they would develop hypotheses and test them. And science was a great boon to humanity. It led to medicine, longer lifespans. It led to better travel, engines, electricity. There were all these great things that happened with science. One of the bad things about science, though, is the idea from science is you can only believe what you can observe and measure and see. So it led to the theory of evolution. Science became at odds in some places with the idea that there is a God, that there is one God. So there was this conflict between science and God. But there were a lot of good things that happened from science. Also, a belief during the modern period is that there's a universal truth. 2 + 2 is always 4, right? It's never 5. If water boils at a certain degree in Cincinnati, then it's probably going to do that over there in China. So there was this view that there are universal truths that are applicable everywhere. Not only was that view in science, but extended to philosophy or theology, the view that there are moral absolutes and love, what's right and wrong, never changes. And so if it's wrong to steal here, it's wrong to steal there. If it's wrong, to have lustful thoughts here, it's wrong to have lustful thoughts there. And what everyone needs and wants is the same thing, because we're all made alike. And so everybody has the same needs and wants at this very basic level. And that's a belief in universal truth that expands not only beyond science, but into philosophy and theology. So science in the modern mindset has affected the way we interpret the Bible. I'm going to give you an example. So since science is a collection of the facts and truths of the physical world, and so what we tried to do with the Bible is decide, well, it's a collection of the facts and truths of the spiritual world. And one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing is topical Bible studies. I used to sell books door to door for the Southwestern Bible Company. I don't recommend you ever do door-to-door sales. That was the worst experience I ever had. I was good at it, except a lot of times I got tired of selling and went and did other things. You can't sell Bibles when you're in the coffee shop. But I made enough to take a little money home. But we had a Nave's topical Bible that we sold. And so the idea was, if you take the Bible and look at every verse about baptism, or every verse about repentance, or every verse about heaven, that you could learn everything you needed to know about the Bible, because it's a collection of spiritual facts. And so we approached the Bible as something that was without error, that had all the spiritual facts. It was the science book for spirituality. That's the way that biblical interpretation was approached. There's another important thing, and that is that just like science, where you can know absolutely what the truth is, when you're interpreting the Bible, the modern mindset is that if you'll study the grammar, the Greek grammar or the Hebrew grammar, and you'll study the history of that time and the context and study what those people were thinking, that doing that will give you sort of the independence or objective view of the Bible. And so modernity taught us that you could have the true interpretation of the Bible by being objective, that you could be objective and you could remove yourself from the situation and know the original context and study the language, and you could know the one true interpretation of the Bible. That was a modern view. And so in the modern view, there's a lot of confidence in self. A lot of people say that Descartes, when he said, "I think, therefore I am," that idea of existence, right? And I can relate to that some. It's amazing that my conscious awareness of myself and my world and ability to think about it tells me that I'm alive, right? That I exist. But what happens is, while that was one of his arguments for existence and for the proof that we are created and that we have our own mind and our own independence, our own choices, that also, in some ways, in the modern world, puts too much confidence in ourselves, because we are confident in our own evaluation of our experience of life, our own evaluation of evidence. So we're in a strange time right now where, I in my own family, people can't agree what truth is anymore. It's the strangest thing I've ever seen. And everybody has their own truth. But there was a time when there was a little bit more unity in the world, and people tended to agree on a lot of things, and there was a lot of confidence in a person's ability to determine the truth. So Last week we talked about evangelism. Well, evangelism in the modern world started with showing that science wasn't incompatible with theology or the Bible. So I have a friend of mine, I haven't talked to him in years, and I keep saying I'm going to call him, and I want to soon, named John Clayton, who did all these videos called Does God Exist? And I think he's still alive, and I have his cell phone if it hasn't changed, so I'm dying to call him. I keep saying I'm going to, and I got on his site, and he updated his videos in 2013. I'm glad, because the ones in the 90s, I kept thinking, oh, those are horrible. And then he updated them in 2000. He updated them again about 7 years ago, and they look a lot better because technology changes. But his big argument is science is not incompatible with what the Bible says about creation. In fact, there's a lot about science that supports it. And he doesn't argue for a literal 24-hour day or for that it has to be millions of years. That part, he just kind of avoids that because there's people that are on both sides. But his point is what we know about the world is not incompatible with what the Bible teaches. And in fact, the Bible amazingly is accurate about the few things it says about science and creation and the origin of life. Science actually lines up with it. So we studied creation, studied reliability of the Bible, go to ancient texts, show that the Bible hasn't been altered. I told y'all last week I studied prophecy and miracles to help people know that this was written by God, and then salvation history, and then the life of Jesus. Well, some people are saying that this is not as effective in evangelism anymore. In fact, some people are saying you need to get rid of that for the postmoderns. I disagree with that. I think this is still important, but I do think that as you approach these subjects with postmoderns, that you have to have a nuanced way of getting there because the postmoderns think differently. I don't think you chunk objective truth. I don't think you chunk some of these arguments I just shared with you, but you have to understand where postmoderns are coming from, and now we're going to talk about postmodernism. So the big thing about postmodernism is the belief in the subjectivity of the individual. They don't believe that you can be objective, and here's their argument. And there's some truth, by the way, to everything I'm going to say in postmodernism. It's like everything. Taken to the extreme, modernism has some flaws. We'll talk about them. Taken to the extreme, postmodernism has a lot of flaws. But it says that you're born in a culture, you have a certain upbringing, your language itself shapes the way you think in your brain. And so the way you've learned language influences who you are. And that because of that, you can't be objective, whether it's about science or the Bible or anything, that there is no way that you can't read this without reading it through the lens of your culture and your upbringing and what you'd already been taught. There's no such thing as being able to go back and get the original context. You can go, but when you're reading that original context, you're reading it through a lens of your own culture, your own pre-beliefs. It's impossible to separate yourself out from that. That's a very important point of postmodernism. And I'll tell you, I can relate. I'm not postmodern at all, but I can relate to that. This caused me a problem as a young man trying to figure out how my good friends that were Christians going to other denominations who are very sincere, how I could be the only one that was right. This caused me a problem as a young man trying to figure that out. So I understand why that's a problem to him. Here's the second part, and now it starts getting, here's where I show my true modern roots, because I have a problem with this one, that truth is contextual and that there's no such thing as universal truth. Every person grows up in a different culture with different traditions and different leanings, and truth is truth in each culture based on what that culture teaches, and you can't push your truth on that culture. That's what they believe. And so the only way to know what truth is, and the belief of postmodernism is truth has to be discovered within you and in your context. And so you have to find your truth, and then you have to be true to your truth. That's why that when it comes to postmodernism, by the way, what's the highest value of postmodernism right now? Somebody's going to get this. It's not very hard. The highest value. Tolerance. That is the highest value of postmodernism right now, tolerance. And so who are you to say that their lifestyle is wrong? They have to look within themselves and be true to themselves, and it comes from within them. That is a postmodern view. And so you have to keep that in mind, that postmoderns are very skeptical of any sort of universal truth. So, yes?
Just going to say which makes them intolerant, but that's...
Well, those of us that are Christians and believe that there is a universal truth and would argue, that's our argument, right, that people who say tolerance is the highest view are not tolerant of those that think that you shouldn't have truth. And of course, that doesn't change their perception, though, that we are saying some things are wrong, and they're saying, where do we have the right to say that? And so you're right, though. It puts us in a dangerous situation because they're not tolerant of any view that judges another view right now. And so it puts Christians who are claiming an absolute truth in a difficult place. And I'm concerned where that may go in the future in this country. I am concerned. I think that we're moving towards a post-Christian country, and I don't think that we're probably going to be able to stop it. I know people are trying, and hey, if they can, great. I try and focus on evangelism and teaching the Word of God, and remember that the church is God's final answer, and God may decide at some time to bring judgment on this nation just to make the church stand up and be what it's supposed to be. I don't know. It gets kind of complicated, but you're right. It's a dangerous time to have views that are intolerant of certain lifestyles. I think one of the things we have to do as Christians, well, I'll get there in a second when we talk about evangelism. We'll come back to that. So they would argue that biblical interpretation is subjective, and there's some truth to this. I don't think you can completely divorce yourself from your upbringing or your views. And so what postmodernists will argue is that when you go to the Bible, you've already decided what you believe. And what you're doing is you're going to the Bible to prove what you already believe. And that is probably true most of the time. You know, most of the time we don't change our mind. And I'll give you just a little example. If you go to Romans chapter 11. And so in Romans chapter 11, beginning in verse 25, Paul's talking about Israel. So the Israelites are lamenting that they've rejected Christ and that they're losing their faith and they're being cut out of the church. And so he says, now I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, and so all Israel will be saved. So what he is saying here literally is right now they've experienced a hardening of their heart, but when the fullness of the time of the Gentiles has happened, and so the church is really for the Gentiles, then all of Israel will be saved. Now, there are different ways of interpreting this. My dad was very literal about the Bible in most cases, and he struggled with this passage because it talks about the fullness of the time of the Gentiles. So it really gives this sense that the church is connected to the Gentiles at some point in time. The Gentiles' time is going to come to end. That says the Jews will come back. Now, what do you believe about this passage? It completely depends on what you believe before you read it. Completely. So, if you're a dispensationalist that believes that the church is sort of an in-between time and at the end time Christ will come back to earth and reestablish his kingdom in Jerusalem here on earth before heaven, then what in the millennium, then what you read when you read this is, oh, this makes sense, right? At the end of the time of the church, the Jews are going to get the kingdom again, and Jesus is to come back here and establish the 1,000-year reign. That makes sense. If you believe that, that makes complete sense. But if you don't believe in dispensationalism and in the millennium and the reign here, and you think it goes from Jews to church to heaven, Then you read that, and what do you argue? Well, this is the spiritual church. And the true Israel in Romans is now the church. The church has become the true Israel. So what you could argue, if you want to be real literalistic here, and my dad thought about this a lot, and he would say, there may be a time where in the fullness of the Gentile time is over, he didn't believe in the millennium, that a lot of Jews are going to be converted to Christ. Well, interestingly, that's kind of going on now. There's a lot of Jews that are coming back to Christ now. They're called Messianic Jews, and there's a movement going on. But do you see, it depends on what you believe before you come to the Bible. And those beliefs are instilled in us at a very early age. And if you were brought up dispensationalist, it's hard to change that. If you were brought up spiritual Israel, it's hard to change that. The point, they say, is it just depends on what you were taught and what you were brought up. And so everything is subject to the way you were brought up. And they would go further to say, if you're brought up in India, you're probably going to be Hindu, depending on where you're brought up. If you're brought up in the Middle East, there's a good chance you're going to be Muslim, unless you're a Jew, right? And so that is their mindset. And so truth is truth according to the culture. So that's what you're dealing here with. And so they would say biblical interpretation is subjective, and wherever you're born will determine what your religion is. In fact, they would argue that all religions are pretty much the same, is what they would argue. So challenges, they challenge naturalism and science. Now this, by the way, is a great inroad into postmodernism. We'll get there in a second. But what is the fastest growing medical field right now?
Genetics?
Actually, believe it or not, it's alternative medicines. It's holistic medicines. It's natural medicines. That is the fastest growing field right now. I'll give one crazy one is CBD oil, right? And so it's some sort of cannabis oil, and I guess they've got it without bringing the bad effects and put it into oil, and they say it's medicinal, and you'll see people swearing by it. And so in our day and time, science is being rejected medically. Even right now, there's a lot of debates, and people are saying, well, this worked for me. Well, we did a scientific study, and the science and math says it doesn't work. Well, it doesn't matter. If all these people say it works, I'm going with these people over here. That science is sort of being pushed to the background and distrusted. And by the way, postmodernists don't trust institutions, and they don't trust authority, right? And so postmodernists have deep distrust of institutions, and so I was going to tell you too. So don't think postmodernism hasn't seeped into some of us. Okay, it's been around long enough now, probably since the early '80s, that without us even realizing it, as it keeps growing, we've become anti-institutional, anti-authority. We've become suspicious of science. So I'm just saying we're all influenced by this. But that's how postmodernists are to a greater degree than modernists. And another thing is that they do not believe in what we would call a meta-narrative. So they don't believe that there's one story that can give meaning everywhere and in every place. And that's what we claim as Christians, right? Is that the story of Jesus can bring meaning everywhere. And they don't believe in a universal meaning or a universal purpose. They believe more in local purposes, tribal purposes. And so what you're seeing now, instead of this push to make everybody one with one language and one culture and bring the universe together, which might be some of what we tried to do here in the United States, right? We were a melting pot. We brought everybody in, and they all became Americans, and we encultured them, and we taught them our language, and that's still what modernists believe in. Well, the postmodernists are against all that. And they say, you need to hang on to your old language. Don't let anybody steal that culture. It's important. Hang on to your old customs and traditions. And so we need to be very sensitive and respectful to all these different cultures and all these different traditions. And so what you'll see now is postmodernists actually looking to relate to something really ancient, which, by the way, is a good way into them with the ancient religion of Jesus Christ. Just saying, But they look to relate to some ancient tribe or some ancient upbringing. I noticed that Christian, our youth minister, let me tell you something that wasn't unusual when I talked to potential youth minister candidates. This came up all the time. Talking to a youth minister candidate, he says, well, I got one question. I said, what is it? Do you think it'll be a problem that I have a tattoo? Did you know that 60% of people in their 20s to 30s have a tattoo? 60%. But these tattoos are a way of finding identity in some sort of subculture, because now it's these going back to the beginning. So Christian has a tattoo on his bicep, and it's Hebrew for Yahweh. Okay? And so I like who he relates to. I like the ancient identification he has with the God of the Hebrews that's on his bicep. And so they don't believe there's one story. They're becoming tribalistic. And so that's something that you have to kind of keep in mind. And then the last thing, we could talk about this for a long time. The last thing, talking about postmoderns, is social justice. So they are open to other cultures, more so than we have been. And they grew up in the day of the internet and, modern technology and modern travel. Never before in the history of the world has the world been so close, in the sense that we know what's going on everywhere. And so they know more about what's going on in all the other countries and the way other people think and the way other people live than we ever have before. And they're influenced by that. And because they don't believe that there's one meta-narrative and that everything is subjective and that truth is contextual, they're more open to understanding how other cultures think than we are. They really are. In fact, I remember back as early as the 70s, as early as the 70s, within churches of Christ, missionaries arguing about how you evangelize. And so there were these missionaries over in Africa that were ACU graduates that were saying, you can't impose American culture. You have to come in, and the worships are different here, and they're more emotional, and you just can't expect them to be Americans. You want them to be Christians. And I remember my dad complaining that some of them looked at his mission team and said, well, y'all are exporting too much American cultural artifacts. Well, I'll tell you, Brazil's a lot closer to the United States than Africa is culturally. But I'm just telling you about the conversations that went on. Both works were very successful, though. The one in Brazil that my dad was involved in, and the one in Africa that a lot of the missionaries from ACU were involved in. They had different methodologies, but they were both very successful. But what postmoderns understand is they understand that there's more than the American experience in the world, and that ours is a privileged experience, and it is. We're the wealthiest country in the world. So it's hard for us to relate unless you lived in a third world country. I lived in Brazil for 13 years, from age 2 to age 15. When I came back to the United States, I could quickly see that there were the ways that the United States talked about the world in itself that were different than the way I saw it when I was in Brazil. And I thought, wow, everything is interpreted by their experience. They don't understand what third world countries think of them and what the experience of third world countries. Well, now I've been here so long, I'm Americanized. I've lost my ability to quickly catch that. But when I came over as a young man, I remember saying, those Americans are a little bit arrogant. And that's how we're viewed by the rest of the world. Well, they're bullies. They think they can come in and tell people how to live and resolve all the conflicts in the world. I'm just telling you the way they think, and I'm proud to be an American. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. In fact, I feel guilty. I don't know about you. I feel guilty to be in a land of such plenty and such freedom. And, it just makes me feel bad sometimes when I look at what other people have. So I'm very glad to be an American, but to whom much is given, much is required. So we have to struggle with that as well, right? The best way to get rid of that guilt is to do something for God. But I'm getting to social justice. I'm actually dancing all around it. I need to get into it. So here are some things that millennials are really aware of that we don't think about. And so if you study the history of the modern era, the England and Europe, and then later the United States, but we'll start with England and Europe. It's easier to see this than the United States, but the United States has done its share. All went to Africa and the New World and South America, and all the goods and money and resources from these poor countries flowed to the European countries. And if you study sort of the economics of the world, what you see is that all the goods and wealth came from the south up to the north. And so the northern countries ended up wealthy. And so from their perspective, the northern rich countries exploited all these other countries. Rather than go in there and keep the money there and help develop these countries, they exploit them to bring wealth to them. That's the way they view the world. And they have some good arguments for it. And so social justice is important. They really feel like, and they really feel for the little guy. And they don't feel like that they are going to have the same, for whatever reason, they don't feel like they're going to get the same benefits that us baby boomers do. I don't know why, but they don't. And they feel like that we all took all the good and left them the leftovers. And so they're sort of bitter about that. I don't think that's a good attitude or helpful for them when they have it. But more importantly, they care about justice. And so when they look at the United States, we may have more equality than anywhere in the world, but they see the flaws. They see we're not perfect. When they look at these other countries, they are very concerned about social justice. No, so it's important to know that they are very in tune to social justices. And when we deny them, we just write them off. You know, I remember reading a book about how to deal with difficult people. Now, can you imagine that was assigned in a ministerial class? You know, that was one of my assignments. It was good I read that. And it said that one of the ways that you deal with a difficult person, it's a good thing y'all aren't difficult because I'm going to give you all my secrets out here. But they say that what you do is you find something that they're talking about you can agree with. Now, here's how you know if you have a difficult person that you can't turn. You agree with them, and then they say, see, that just shows how I'm right, and you're wrong all the time. You know, then you go, okay, well, this one is only going to see it one way. But what you do is you disarm them by agreeing with some of what they say, and then they go, well, they actually agreed with some of what I said. And then the idea is to open them up so that they'll listen to you. Well, if you just argue with a millennial and try and show them all the ways that they're wrong, you're going to lose them. So the best way to reach a millennial is to try and agree with the truth you see. And then rather than arguing about all those things, steer them back to something that has to do with Jesus. You're never going to convert them by arguing politics or economics with them or social justice.
From a millennial, I guess. You know, I think it's often the older people are so set in their ways that they aren't willing to look at the other side of it. You know, even just this political season, it's like, well, this, and they're not willing to look at maybe some of the truth in ours. Does that make sense?
Some of the what?
The truth that we're saying.
Yeah.
You know, they're set on their opinion and they're not going to come. You know, so then, to be honest, we're just like, whatever. You know, we're not going to change you. And I'm not saying, you know, it could be anything. I'm not saying that the older people are wrong because I tend to agree with them often. But from a millennial side, it is also, we need you guys to see, which is what you're saying, see our truth. But, I don't know, not try to persuade us, I guess.
Yeah.
Maybe take a step back and say,
So from a millennial that has a long pedigree at this church, she's agreeing with what I said, basically. That millennials are turned off when you can't see that an intelligent, caring believer or non-believer could have that view. And when we become too adamant about the wrong things, then we lose them. And so it's important to understand that what they've learned to do is to see the other side, and they see two sides. So be careful that you don't start arguing about the things that make no difference in the world. Make sure that you find areas of understanding where they're coming from and they understand that you understand them, and then move to something more important.
I was just going to say everybody's that way. You don't have to be a millennialist. I have a hard time saying that. An old person. We're all that way. If you talk to them.
Yeah, that's just common sense, isn't it? That you relate to people. But for some reason, the views that the millennials have about social justice and subjectivity clash enough with the modern viewpoint that a lot of times some of the older modern generation just can't accept them. And so that puts a rift between the two generations. But you're right, that the methodology is an old one, right? Understand them, show you understand them, find areas where you can see why they believe that and agree with them, and then move to something more important.
You have to take things out one at a time and replace it with the truth.
Well, and
I have to say, like I very much am I do see that side. I'm just saying, like when people are talking to millennials, that I know exactly what you're describing. And I don't feel like we hear so much that way. And I will say, I think Withensfield does a good job reaching those millennials, or trying, being subtle about things we say. But I think it's, I don't know, just listening, I guess.
yeah. So let me throw this plug out too. So I think that what the leaders need to think about, so I'm talking to elders and ministers now, and the older generation, now I've just expanded it a lot, right, is that the type of church we're comfortable with is not going to be the type of church that exists in 20 years. It's just not. It's going to be different. And so it's important that we learn to plant the church, to help the church grow into a church that's going to be here for the younger generation, that's going to teach Jesus and save people. And so we have to give deep thought to what is something that we're just comfortable with or like versus what does this church need to look like 20 years from now. It's really important that we're willing to sacrifice our needs. Listen, I'm 61. I don't care if we ever change anything, Mark?
Well, I think as we're talking about that, one of the things that we need to do with ourselves first is to understand what are those things that are foundational.
Yeah.
What are the things that are true, and what things are just cultural, what things are just the way that we do that. What are the essentials of the Bible? What do you have to do to be saved? That God is King and Lord, and start from there. Understand, have a clear view of that, and then these are the things that we can talk about. We can find commonality, and we can discuss.
Yeah, and here's the way I prefer to do it is, millennials, most millennials, especially non-Christian millennials, just see all Christians as Christians. And I think what's important is we figure out what are foundational truths that you can't compromise and still be a Christian. And then what are these areas of interpretation that different churches have different interpretations, but they still believe Jesus is Lord. And it doesn't mean that we have to change our view. Okay, so I'm not saying that, but we need to teach it in a way that, look, we're Christians. There's a lot of Christians out there. Here's what we teach and believe. Well, this church believes that. Well, that's fine, but here's what we believe, and here's why we believe it. And what we have in common with them is they believe Jesus is Lord. But they're turned off by a group that says they're right about everything and everybody else is wrong. And sometimes for good reason. Okay, Monty, and then I got to close my class out.
I just want to call Cindy had a comment that you missed.
I was just going to say that what I have run into through work in the ID&E kind of discussions is that it's not postmodernism. I feel they insist that we go along with that versus modernism, a blending of the two, as Mark was saying, foundationally, that would be the nicest alternative, because there are plenty of things that modernism has correct, but I'm not feeling from the other side.
Well,
I'm modernist, that
yeah.
they want anything but us to, if you don't believe what we believe, then you're wrong.
Right. Well, so here's what you have to realize. To say there's two sides is part of the problem in our culture. Is everything's black and white. There's no gray. And so you got the extremists on the right and the extremists on the left, and they'd kill each other if they could. And one would come out a winner and the other one would be in the grave. But you can't reach either of them. And neither, but there's a whole lot of shades of gray in the middle. And so, and there's a lot. And so the people that are extreme probably aren't reachable anyhow. So I think, but there's a lot of people that are shades of the middle, and we need to understand them and understand where they're coming from.
Can I correct that?
Yeah.
They may not be reachable by us. When you say that, I think of Saul persecuting the Christians.
Yeah.
He was way over on one side and so on.
Yeah.
God
can reach him. God can reach him, but let's not judge everybody by the extremes. That's a better way to put it. Let's not judge everybody by the extremes. God can reach them, but we can't. And sometimes. So, well, I'm out of time. What I'm missing is how to do postmodern evangelism. Here it comes. Are you ready? All right. Authenticity is really important. They see the way you live more than what you say. And if they can't see Jesus living in you, they're not going to listen to you. But if they see your life reflecting Jesus, that's going to have an impact on them. Second thing, hospitality. You're not going to convert any of these people at arm's length. You have to bring them into your life. And if they learn you and get to know you and have a friendship with you, they'll listen to you. Third, use stories. One person says he'd go to Lazarus and the rich man, and Lazarus is in heaven or in paradise, and the rich man's in hell, and they can see each other. And he says, "Do you believe in hell? And do you believe? And why do you believe the rich man went where he did? And why do you believe Lazarus went where he did? And what do you think the end of life is?" So use stories. Ravi Zachariah said that. He was talking about your millennials, and they said, well, what about all of these people in Muslim world? And he told the story of a Muslim that had a dream about Jesus, became a Christian. Well, how do you argue that? And so use stories. Biblical wisdom. There's great biblical wisdom. It teaches against materialism, which millennials like. It teaches to care for the poor, which millennials are in tune to. It teaches the key to life is joy and forgiveness and putting others above yourself. That will all resonate with them. The life of Jesus will resonate with them. Ancient witnesses, they listen to testimonies of people, bring the people that lived with Jesus back to life, and let them hear the ancient witness of the stories of these people whose lives were changed by Jesus. Okay, and then last thing, you got to make room for evangelism. And I'm sorry I had to rush through that. I would have done some of this next week, but next week Mark Mason is going to teach for me. I'm going to go over to the teens and talk with the teens next week. And so Mark is going to finish out this class on evangelism. Appreciate all of your attention and the good questions and comments today. Since we're already 4 minutes over, go in peace.